Well, February's almost over, but I have been making this one block quilt and just loving it. My music is blaring in the background, the snow is flying outside, and I'm using my cut squares. How perfect is that? Sometimes I just look at the fabrics that I have in my stash. Everybody has a stash of some sort. And I pick out two of my bins. This time I've picked out a 5-inch cut squares and 3-inch cut squares. I've decided that I'm going to make something that's brown, basically brown in color, and I have a lot of brown fabrics. And you know, people give me things. So sometimes the fabrics that I get are kind of dull or boring or not very exciting. But when you put them together with something else, they often will start to shine. So I've picked out brown colors, brown gold, brown green, brown blue, brown red, in it something that's kind of in that pattern way. Most of it's gold, brown, and red brown. And, it just is working. And the off color is white. This time I'm using white. I don't have a lot of white cut squares, but when I find them, there are often a little pile of them, and it's nice to be able to use them. But if I don't have enough white cut squares in this stash of mine, I've got white scraps that I can cut and use for this project. My goal in this project is to make a one-block quilt. One-block quilt, all of the quilt blocks are the same, and you just make a pattern from how you place the blocks. And one-block quilts are really relatively easy to design and to assemble, and you can arrange them in a few different ways more often. They're very efficient. They're made very quickly. I can do a lot of chain piecing with my blocks, and I can assemble them quite quickly because there's not really a lot of thinking or planning. It's just continuous sewing and repetitive sewing. But there is that thing, repetitive sewing can be a bit monotonous at times. If you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, it can get a bit boring. And you know me, I like to do things spontaneously, and I like to do things that are creative. So how do I make this creative for myself? Well, I don't know. I think I just need some time sometimes, every once in a while, just to sit and do some mindless sewing that I don't have to think very hard. And sometimes in February, when it's snowing outside and you don't really have other things to do, that could be a bonus. You don't really have to match anything or achieve anything. You want to try to make the blocks align so that, the quilt police don't come after you. But sometimes a little bit of free form is not so bad either. Compared to quilts with multiple types of blocks, one block quilt may be less visually pleasing, but if you pick colors and patterns that are nice to get together, then I think you will have a better chance at having a quilt that you like. There are lots of different one-block quilts. The one that I'm making, I don't really know if there is a name for it, but I've seen quilts like it. It's just a 4-patch made out of the center blocks and then corner blocks around the outside. But the way I'm making it gives a lot of variety in the color choices because I'm cutting them up quite a bit. So with these 4 patches, here that are on the screen right now, the 4 patches are made with 3-inch squares. But you could start with any size square that you have. It doesn't have to be a 3-inch square. I started with the 3-inch squares, and then I'm using the 5-inch squares for the corner blocks. And that is, with 4 of those put together, that gives me an 8.5-inch finished block, which is a good size, because if I put 7 across and 9 down, it will make a nice single bed size. But I think it's starting out quite nicely, and it's easy to do. And like I said, you can't hear it, but my music is just going crazy in the background. I don't think you really want to hear it, but I certainly like it, and it gives me something to think about while I'm doing this sewing. There's lots of ways of cutting and different methods of using these blocks. I am a scissors person. I know people have these little clippers. They like those little clippers to separate the blocks. Here, I'm just showing you a few, and I take them over to the ironing board, and this is one of my little tricks. I fold them in half crosswise like that, and I press it at that point. And that saves me a lot of time, because now I'm going to take my 5-inch block and put it on the 4 patch that I've just made. And instead of drawing lines with a pencil or a marker, I press it. And when I pick out the other fabric, I picked out a 5-inch block. It's going to be bigger than my block, smaller than my block. And I can see the corners at the edges, and I know where I've done that press line. So if I just put my 2 corners of the 5-inch block on top of my 4 patch, I can see that it's kind of uniformly in the middle, and then all I do is sew on either side of that press mark that I put on the white squares of the 4 patch. And I go across, and I do a whole long chain of those. And then I turn the chain around, and I come back and I sew the other side of that line. Now, I'm never, ever going to get a perfect corner on the brown square of the 4 patch when I cut this apart and press it open. I'm never, ever going to get that. And I know that. But I'm happy making these patches quickly and using up what I've got, rather than making a lot of effort to get those corners in place. So after making hundreds of these, I start putting them together as a 4 patch. The 4 patch, the 3-inch blocks are going to be in the center, and the solid corner blocks are on the outside. So now it's just, again, going through and doing a whole long chain of making these blocks. Easy to do. Just sit there, take one of the pressed pieces, set it on, turn it over, eyeball it a little bit, and make sure you've got it in the right place. Then I turn it over so I can sew my line of stitching on one side of the pressed line. It's easy to do, and I get a lot of blocks done in a short period of time. So when I have a whole chain of these pieces cut, I just take them, and one by one I cut across the press line that I sewed on either side of. I know people would maybe prefer to use their cutting ruler and cutting rotary cutter, lay them down on a cutting mat. But I just take my scissors and one by one cut them apart. That's my method. I like to do it that way. I'm happy doing it that way. And then the next step is to go over to the iron once again, press those blocks out, and then it's time to trim them. When I set them all out on the table one at a time, I put my diagonal line and the diagonal line of the ruler together, and I know I have to trim 2 sides at least, and probably the other 2 sides need to have a little bit of a trim as well. I'm making these 4 1/2 inches square. So the diagonal once again goes on the diagonal line, and I make sure that the 4 1/2 inch mark is there, both sides, and give it a nice little trim. And there is 1/4 of the final block. 4 of those put together make an 8 1/2 inch block. So again, I like to do things in multiples. If I'm doing a 1-block quilt, I can just have 50 of those and just go one after the other and cut, and then they're all done, and I can start placing them on the design wall and make my pattern. These kind of quilts are quite easy to do if you are not a person who starts a quilt and ends a quilt before you start another quilt, like I do. These kind of blocks are really easy to store. But my problem is if I put something in a box or a bin and put it in the cupboard, I'm not likely to get it back out again for a while. And I always make one of the blocks with measurements so I can remember at that time what I did, so I don't get the next blocks a different size. But I'm not really one of those people that puts a project half done in a cupboard. So see here, I've got a whole pile, and under my desk I have one bin dedicated to fabric scraps, and those things go into kitty litter bags. Now that I've got a whole bunch of these corner blocks, I put 4 of those together, make sure that the four patches are going to be in the center. And again, I'm going to do this in a chain piecing method, because if I have to stop and start at those corners and backstitch each time, it's a bit awkward, and it's so much easier using the block as a leader or an ender, so your presser foot glides nicer on it and you have a smoother sewing experience. Now that makes sense to me, and it's a happy day for me. So I keep going, I make a whole big long row and make a chain, and then I'll sew them together. So once again, it's easy to maintain this kind of a sewing technique, keeping your blocks even, trying to match up your corners a little bit so that your block has a balance to it. Sometimes the browns, in my case, sometimes the browns, there's one dark one in the center. It looks a little awkward. So when I am making these chains, I try to at least edit a few things, either corners or centers, and I swap things out to make them look a little bit more uniform, because I know they're going to go up on the wall, and something would stand out like a sore thumb if I didn't do something to edit them ahead of time. They're very random, and I haven't really spent a lot of time picking and choosing colors. So here I am. I'm just going to finish a whole long row, and then I will trim them apart, and they don't really need any extra trimming after I have these 4 patches together. I'm just going to press them and put them up on the design wall and show you what I'm making. They're 8.5 inches, and if I put them side on, then the squares in the center with the white are going to show up as being a square to square, and it's very uniform. Again, if I'm doing it that way, I'm going to try to get a light dark kind of effect, and I can turn the blocks halfway and see what I can do. But if I move every second row down half block, I get a zigzag. And then all I need to do at the top and the bottom is put half squares in half of the rows, and that will give me a nice zigzag. And I think I've decided this time I'm going to make a zigzag instead of having the white squares stand out proudly. So that's my goal this time. I'm just going to do a big zigzag. Look at me, making decisions, looking into the camera. And thank you to all of the subscribers who have given me well wishes. My neck is a lot better than it was a couple weeks ago. I still have a mark on my neck and it's still a bit sore, but everything is fine. It's healing up nicely and I'm feeling much better. So next time I make a new video, I hope to even have more improvement. I know I'm just taking my sewing a little easy. I'm not being too extravagant, but I'll have a nice quilt. Sometimes I might make a zigzag, sometimes I might make the square. It depends on the colors that I've used and the patterns, and if I'm careful about it, I can get a nice effect from the light, dark. But most of these browns are all the same value. There's not a lot of difference, and the only thing that makes them stand out differently is basically whether they're yellow brown, green brown, or blue brown, or light or dark. So I think I'm going to go with the zigzag fashion because I think that's going to give a more defined effect on this quilt. And I just keep putting them on the wall.